See this guy right here? This is John Scott, a 6'8", 260-pound enforcer who's racked up a whopping 11 points in parts of his 8 seasons in the NHL. Despite that stat line, he somehow finds himself captain of the Pacific Division in the 2016 NHL All-Star Game. This wasn't supposed to happen, but when NHL fans created a movement to turn a journeyman enforcer to an NHL All-Star, it had the potential to create a moment that hockey fans would never forget. The enforcer, the player responsible for dropping the mitts and making sure he keeps everyone on the other team in check while protecting his teammates. As the game gets progressively faster, the NHL has seen a steep decline of pure enforcers. However, one of the few remaining enforcers in the NHL during 2016 was none other than John Scott himself. Other than jumping Phil Kessel in an NHL preseason game and causing a full-blown brawl, John Scott was just another enforcer in the NHL who was slowly being phased out of the game. Scott spent most of his time in and out of NHL lineups for 7 seasons, literally fighting for a job. Playing for 5 different teams in that span, he never played more than 56 games in a season, and when he was in the lineup, the guy barely averaged 7 minutes of ice time. When the 2015-2016 season rolled around, the NHL was taking another step in becoming a league dominated by speed and skill. Some kid named Connor McDavid went first overall, probably a bust, but the NHL continued to implement rule changes aimed at increasing scoring by implementing 3-on-3 overtime. Combine that with the rise of advanced analytics becoming a key tool for organizations to build their team, the direction of the league meant that John Scott was pretty much on his way out. However, the rebuilding Arizona Coyotes needed a vet with some toughness, and so they signed a 32-year-old to a 1-year deal. So for him to make the All-Star game, he potted 50 goals in the first 40 games and carried the Arizona Coyotes to first place. Just kidding. Now, what really happened was to be expected. By the time January rolled around, Scott got healthy scratched most nights and only ended up playing in 11 games. However, in early November, Sportsnet's Jeff Marek joked on the Marek and Wyshynski podcast that it would be funny to see Scott in the All-Star Game's new 3-on-3 format. This is because leading into the 2016 NHL All-Star Game, the league introduced a new fan voting format where fans could vote their favorite players to participate in the All-Star Game. The player with the most votes from each division would serve as the captain for their respective team. Fans were allowed to vote for anyone, even a 32-year-old enforcer with 11 career points. So that's exactly what they did. What started as a joke on a podcast quickly snowballed into a movement. With an overwhelming amount of support on Twitter and Reddit, John Scott had received more votes than any player in the league by the time the voting polls closed. That made it official. A 32-year-old enforcer was going to the All-Star Game, and it would make for great marketing for the NHL. Except, that's not how the NHL saw it at all. The league had said it would provide weekly updates on the voting. They had done so in previous years, but once Scott took over the top spot, the updates stopped. David Poile, who was the GM of the All-Star host Nashville Predators at the time, told Yahoo in December that Scott making the team would be, with all due respect, not an appropriate situation. Scott appreciated the humor of the movement, and while he was happy about the support, he told reporters that he didn't think he deserved to be voted in, and he hoped he wouldn't be. As the voting continued, Scott admitted later in his Players Tribune that the NHL tried to convince him to drop out of the All-Star Game. They told him bluntly that this wasn't a game for him and that he should probably put a stop to the movement, while questioning whether or not this would be a moment that his kids would be proud of. That pissed off John Scott even more, and it meant that there was no stopping the John Scott All-Star movement. When it was all said and done, the 4 captains were Jaromir Jagr, Alex Ovechkin, Patrick Kane, and John Scott. The 32-year-old enforcer, who already hit the waiver wire 3 times that season, was going to the All-Star Game. Everything was set, but with just a little over 2 weeks before the All-Star Game, the Arizona Coyotes traded John Scott to the Montreal Canadiens. Immediately after the trade, the Canadiens sent Scott down to the AHL to St. John's. The timing of this trade instantly created speculation as to if this was all orchestrated by the NHL. TSN's Bob McKenzie reported that the deal was likely to keep Scott out of the All-Star Game, which, if we're being honest, come on. Do the Montreal Canadiens really need a 6'8" enforcer with 11 career points? Probably not. Of course, this caused outrage for many fans online and led to the movement of #FreeJohnScott. In an event that was supposed to be put on for the fans' entertainment, the NHL was doing everything they could to stop this from happening. But despite their efforts, John Scott was going to the All-Star Game. And what would follow would be one of the most memorable All-Star moments in NHL history. After competing in the hardest shot competition and channeling his inner Gretzky in the breakaway challenge, John Scott would ultimately steal the show in the 3-on-3 tournament.
Is all. Daryl Sutter, coach of this team, said that everybody wanted to have at least one shift with John Scott, and there is a time goal. And John Scott will get a standing ovation.
We are talking about how Brent Burns and Joe Pavelski, former teammates, and now Scott puts Kane on his wallet.
In on a breakaway, save made by Rene. Oh my! It's Scott and Kane.
Well, Scott chirped him before, and then Kane went right after him after he got steamrolled in the neutral. That's awesome. Listen to the crowd.
Still, they feverishly battle Carlson there. 2 seconds and one. Gotta shoot. Backhands one. Goal. And saved by Gibson. And the Pacific has won.
After being begged to drop out of the All-Star Game and nearly getting screwed out of a great moment by the league themselves, John Scott gave NHL fans one of the greatest All-Star performances of all time. Scoring 2 goals, getting in the scrap with the greatest American-born player in NHL history, and winning the entire tournament, NHL fans gave John Scott a moment he would never forget, and he returned the favor. A 32-year-old enforcer who had a grand total of 11 career points was about to officially become an NHL All-Star MVP.
The 2016 Honda NHL All-Star MVP.